In 1974, Peter Andrews bought land that was officially considered a lost cause. Where a stream had once run, there was now a 2-meter ditch with a dry bed and collapsing banks. And instead of declaring war on the weeds, he let them grow. He stopped pulling out blackberry, stopped clearing the floodplain, left the trees along the creeks alone, even though he was told to cut them down. To most farmers, this looked like complete madness. But Andrews believed the very plants everyone considered the enemy could be the ones to save the land. 40 years later, Australia's Prime Minister would fly out to his farm to see the result for himself. To understand why this looked almost criminal, and why Andrews refused to back down anyway, you need to know what happened to Australian land in the 150 years before he bought this farm. Before 1788, the streams of southeastern Australia didn't drain water away, they held onto it. Chains of shallow ponds ran along the valleys, linked by marshes and reeds. Water soaked into the ground, returned during droughts, and fed pastures from below, through the soil rather than through rain. Then British engineers arrived and began straightening, draining, clearing. Within 150 years, almost every one of those pond chains had vanished. In their place, deep channels that carried rainwater out to the ocean within hours. Without moisture held in the soil, ancient salt deposits began rising to the surface. By 1974, 2/3 of Australia's farmland showed signs of erosion or salinity. The government's official response to this crisis was simple: cut down the willows. Willows were declared a weed of national significance, and millions were spent destroying them along more than 30,000 kilometers of waterways. The rivers kept drying up. Peter Andrews grew up on a sheep station near Broken Hill, one of the driest places in Australia. As a child, he walked over ground scattered with fossilized seashells, hundreds of millions of years old. Undeniable proof that this desert had once been ocean. He decided then that land remembers, and that it can be something other than what it currently is. Andrews had no degree in hydrology or ecology. What he had were decades of watching how Australian land behaved after rain, during drought, after plowing. That's what he brought to Tarwin Park in 1974. He spent months there simply walking the land, studying the shape of the dry depressions in the fields, reading the colors of the soil, looking in the terrain for traces of how water used to move across it. Gradually, he understood something no agronomist was saying. Willow grows where water already is, or once was. It's an indicator of a problem, not the cause of one. The same held for blackberry, thistle, reed. Each appeared exactly where it was doing a specific job. Blackberry was the first to colonize the worst ground, places where the soil was so compacted that no cultivated plant could break through. Its roots cracked that hard pan open, letting water and air reach deeper. Thistle showed up where the soil was depleted. Its long taproot reached down into deep layers and pulled minerals back up to the surface where other plants could use them. Reed settled along banks and shallows. It slowed the current, spread the water wider instead of letting it cut the channel deeper, and trapped silt that gradually raised the stream bed. Willow anchored banks that decades of plowing and grazing had turned into sand that collapsed with every flood. Andrews didn't see chaotic overgrowth. He saw a sequence of repair. Each plant in its place, each with a specific function. But not interfering didn't mean simply standing aside. The first step was feeding the land. Andrews brought organic matter onto the worst-hit ground, cut vegetation, branches, even the blackberry the law required him to destroy. The organic matter rotted down and fed soil microorganisms that had vanished for decades along with the moisture. Without a living bacterial layer, no plant could take hold for long. Roots entered dead soil and simply stopped. Andrews wasn't restoring plants. He was restoring the environment plants needed in order to work on their own. The second step was low weirs. The third was waiting. He never intended for these plants to stay forever. His logic rested on a simple sequence biologists call succession. Pioneer species move first onto damaged ground, stabilize it, build up organic matter, and gradually give way to what comes next. Willow wasn't the end point, it was the first step, the fastest one available. Alongside this, he began building low, leaky weirs in the channel out of stone, logs, and hay bales, each costing $200 to $400, with no contractors and no heavy machinery. Not dams that stopped the water, but weirs that simply slowed it down. Water lingered longer, had time to soak into the banks, and sediment built up behind the weirs, gradually raising the stream bed. A channel that had cut ever deeper into the land for years began climbing back toward floodplain level and reconnecting with it. While the government spent millions destroying willows along thousands of kilometers of rivers, Andrews was planting them at his own expense. The neighbors noticed, and they called the council. The council sent inspectors. The inspectors arrived with citations and stopped at the gate. Andrews came out to meet them and started explaining. Every year, the same scene, the same gate, the same official with paper in hand. This went on for 30 years. The early years at Tarwin Park produced no visible proof of anything, only neighbors' complaints and annual inspections. On the surface, nothing changed, but underground, something was beginning. The first thing Andrews himself noticed was that the soil in the low ground stopped cracking so quickly after rain. Water that used to run off into the gully within hours started lingering for a day, then two. The weirs were doing their work, sediment built up behind them and gradually raised the channel bed. A channel that had cut ever deeper into the land for years began climbing back toward floodplain level. Once it finally reconnected with its banks, water started spreading sideways during rain, for the first time in decades, instead of carving straight down. The second signal was grass. Pastures in the low-lying areas where the weirs held water longest started greening earlier in spring and holding their color longer through the dry season. Not all at once. First strips along the channel, then wider bands, as underground moisture spread outward from the restored floodplain. Andrews hadn't sown any of this grass. It came back on its own, following the water. The third and most unexpected sign was salt. It began retreating, not vanishing, but the white crusts on the soil surface that had spread for years stopped, then started shrinking, wherever groundwater rose high enough to shift the balance between fresh water and the ancient salt deposits below. All of this happened slowly, invisibly to an outside eye. Neighbors saw willows and blackberry. Officials saw violations of the law. No one looked underground. When one of the worst droughts in the state's history hit New South Wales in 1983, neighboring farms began giving up one after another. Livestock across the region was sold for nothing or died in the fields. Pastures turned to dust. At Tarwin Park, meanwhile, the creek kept flowing. The grass stayed green, and Andrews' horses grazed on pasture that by every agronomic forecast shouldn't have existed. Neighbors came to look and went home not knowing what to make of it. Official agronomy chalked it up to geological luck, a quirk of that particular block of land that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. Andrews said otherwise. No one listened. In 1994, the bank repossessed Tarwin Park. Not because the method didn't work. The farm stayed green while everything around it turned yellow. It was because Andrews poured all his money into proving what he could already see with his own eyes, and none into running the farm as a business. 5 years later, in 1999, his son Stuart bought the farm back from the bank and took on the debt. He had grown up on this land, watched what was happening to it, and decided to keep going, with no guarantee anyone would ever admit his father had been right. The first crack in the wall of official silence appeared in October 1997, when hydrogeologist Paul Anderson from the University of Technology, Sydney, arrived at Tarwin Park. He was writing a master's thesis and came to measure, not to argue. He mapped the aquifer, sampled salinity at different depths, and compared Tarwin Park's readings against neighboring properties that were still mowing, spraying, and clearing vegetation along their banks. The thesis, submitted that same October, reached an unambiguous conclusion. The aquifer beneath Tarwin Park, which had degraded for 100 years, was now being recharged with fresh water. Groundwater levels had risen. Salt was retreating. Pasture productivity had increased. It was the first official document of any kind to confirm what Andrews had been saying for 20 years. That same year, the local council handed him another citation for failing to destroy willows under the Noxious Weeds Act. The inspectors kept coming back, right on schedule. In July 2002, the CSIRO, Australia's leading scientific body, sent a team of experts to Tarwin Park. The report was dry and technical, with no enthusiasm in it at all. It described a successful and sustainable farming system, significant agronomic and ecological improvement, increased groundwater reserves, and noted that the financial cost of implementing it had been minimal. A scientific institution had quietly and officially confirmed that the man the valley had called crazy for years had been right. The neighbors kept complaining. The first public ally with real weight was Gerry Harvey, one of Australia's best-known businessmen. Harvey owned the Barramul horse stud in the Widden Valley. Expensive land with degraded creeks and falling productivity. He invited Andrews out. Andrews came, walked the land, read the terrain, and started work. The same logic with plants as at Tarwin Park. Within 2 years, the creeks at Barramul had reconnected with their floodplains. The pastures began recovering productivity, and the land's own value rose. Harvey said publicly, there was no doubt at all that Andrews was right. A man used to counting money and results had done the math and sided with Andrews. It was the first crack, not in the wall of science, but in the wall of public opinion. That same year, in 2005, Tony Coote, a businessman and chairman of the Angus & Coote jewelry chain, was watching television in his Sydney apartment. ABC was airing another installment, the fourth, of Australian story about Andrews. No subject in the show's history had appeared that many times. Coote watched and thought about his own land. 23,000 hectares in the Mulloon Valley, bought back in the 1960s, slowly dying the same way Tarwin Park once had. The creek had become a gully, the floodplain was drying out, productivity was falling. Within a few weeks of watching, he called Andrews. In 2006, they began work on a 3-kilometer stretch of Mulloon Creek. The first step looked like a deliberate provocation. The team dumped 6 truckloads of blackberry into the channel, the very plant the Noxious Weeds Act required them to destroy. The same logic as at Tarwin Park, but now under scientific observation and at a larger scale. They built leaky weirs from stone and logs, each costing $200 to $400 with no heavy machinery. The weirs did not block the water, they slowed it, forcing it to settle into the banks instead of racing downstream to the sea. Thousands of willows, reeds, and grasses went in along the banks, and fencing went up to keep livestock off the recovery area. Piezometers were installed in the floodplain to measure changes in groundwater levels, and flow meters were set up above and below the site to track what was happening to the water in numbers, not just by eye. Nothing especially dramatic happened in the first years. The weirs stood, the plants grew, the soil absorbed moisture slowly and invisibly, but the piezometers were recording what could not be seen from above. Groundwater levels in the floodplain were gradually rising. The creek was starting to connect with its banks not just during rain, but continuously, through capillary pressure in saturated soil. Early results from the pilot site caught neighbors' attention, and they began joining in, cautiously at first, then one after another. By 2018, the method was in use across 20 adjoining properties and 50 kilometers of waterways in the catchment. When the 2018 drought hit, 7 months under 150 millimeters of rainfall, the driest such stretch in the southern tableland's official climate record, the difference became visible between a floodplain that functions like a sponge and one that had long since become a drain. Across the region, farms that had survived dozens of previous droughts began to collapse. Livestock sold for nothing, wells running dry, no grass growing. At Mulloon Creek, the stream ran full and clear. Coote told journalists that more water was flowing out of the lower part of their catchment than was coming in from above. The vegetation was adding roughly another 100 millimeters of moisture a year through condensation and fog, an effect no agronomy textbook had predicted. Stocking rates per hectare rose from 120 to 149 head, and the floodplain, saturated for meters down, was feeding into the Shoalhaven River catchment, and beyond it, Tallowa Dam, a backup drinking water source for Sydney's 5 million residents. In September 2016, the United Nations listed Mulloon Creek among 5 demonstration projects for sustainable agriculture worldwide. A peer-reviewed paper appeared in 2022 in the journal Ecological Management and Restoration. Between 2019 and 2024, the method was tested across 7 properties in the Upper Hunter Valley, cutting soil erosion by 68%. Official science had one objection for years. Willows consume up to 15 millimeters of water a day, compared to under 2 for native eucalyptus. That single figure was the basis for government policy destroying willows along 30,000 kilometers of waterways. But the calculation ignored the main point. If a creek is no longer connected to its floodplain, there's no water there for a willow to steal in the first place. You can pull out willows all you like. The water will still drain to the ocean within hours regardless. Andrews had said this for 30 years. No one answered him. There are two photographs taken from the same point above the Tarwin Park floodplain. The first, mid-1970s, cracked yellow earth, a bare gully, not a scrap of shade. The second, mid-2000s, reeds, a chain of ponds, willows along the banks. Between the two photos, no one planted or irrigated anything. The only thing that changed was that a person stopped pulling out what grew on its own. Peter Andrews received the Order of Australia in 2011, the country's highest civilian honor. The same state that had sent him inspectors with citations for 30 years now handed him a medal. But by then, he could no longer return to Tarwin Park. The Korean state-owned company KEPCO had bought up land in the Bailong Valley for a coal mine, and Stewart sold in 2014, not because the method had failed, but because the family was exhausted. In October 2018, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and his deputy Michael McCormack visited Maloon Creek. All around them, land scorched by drought, dry for dozens of kilometers in every direction. Beneath their feet, a green, full-flowing creek. McCormack told reporters it was a model for everyone, one that needed to be replicated across the country. Tony Kuti missed that day by exactly 2 months. He died in August 2018 at 79. For 13 years, he had funded, built, and defended something no one believed in, and he was gone 8 weeks before the country's prime minister stood on the bank of his creek and admitted he'd been right. Hundreds gathered at his funeral. He was laid to rest in a coffin hand-woven from willow, the very plant the government had spent decades declaring a noxious weed. In September 2019, the Independent Planning Commission denied KEPCO's mine, citing among its reasons the unacceptable impact on Tarwin Park's heritage and the company's failure to prove it could restore more than 400 hectares of strategic farmland after mining. What Andrews had done to that land over 30 years became part of the case against the mine. KEPCO appealed, lost, appealed again, lost again. In February 2022, the Supreme Court denied the right to appeal further. The project was shut down. A farm agronomist had declared dead in 1974 turned out to be alive enough to stop a coal mine worth more than $750 million. Peter Andrews is in his 80s now. He still goes out onto the land and advises farmers. His son Stuart runs training courses through Tarwin Park Training. More than 1,000 people had completed them by the end of 2022. His grandsons Lachlan and Hamish run their own farm in Queensland, a third generation. The Maloon Institute has grown from 5 staff to more than 20 and is running projects across Australia. Peer-reviewed science is slowly catching up to what Andrews saw walking over dry ground back in 1974. Tarwin Park still belongs to KEPCO. There will be no mine, but there's no working farm there either. The land is still there. The creeks Andrews spent 30 years restoring are still there. What happens to them next, no one knows.